Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to this session about the Leveson inquiry into the press and its aftermath, which continues to be pretty lively. We have an extraordinarily interesting set of people to talk about this. Going from the left, Brian Cathcart, who has been in journalism, I think he says, for 35 years. So you must have been counting. Reuters, The Independent, titled Deputy Editor of The Independent on Sunday. In fact, Brian and I overlapped there. I should say that everybody on this platform is a journalist. In fact, we're probably all now pretty typical journalists. Namely, none of us are exactly quite full-time. Well, maybe you are, Trevor. Part-time, that's it. The new model of journalism is a sort of hybridity of profession where you make a living doing one thing and you do journalism in your other time. But Brian Cathcart is also the director and co-founder of Hacked Off and has been a primary player in the Hacked Off campaign, including the recent negotiations with the political parties, which I'm sure you've read about. Trevor Kavanagh began his career in journalism in Australia, I believe. Is that not quite correct?
No, it was a £10 top went out to Australia.
Ah, okay.
I've done a bit in local papers here.
Okay. But you got the start of, certainly you first worked for News International in Australia, and then a very long and distinguished career on The Sun. Well, you're still associate editor on The Sun. Yeah, so associate editor, part-time associate editor, therefore hybrid journalist, the rest of us. On my right, Professor Stephen Barnett from the University of Westminster. Steve is also a journalist. He was a very fine columnist on The Observer for many years, and now you distribute your journalism in more Catholic fashion. As I do myself, I write for the tabloid, the tablet every now and then, not the tabloid, the tablet every now and again, to my great surprise. Steve has a very, very interesting book about television recently out, not advertised on the podium, he regrets to say, but definitely of interest. Well, speaking of which, over on my right, Mick Hume, who was brilliantly represented in marketing terms by the poster to our right. Mick created a magazine called Living Marxism, and it must have been part of that fashion, Mick, when things got reduced to their alphabetic...
Yeah, Cornetonian.
Yeah. It became LM magazine, and didn't survive a rather loud libel struggle over one story that LM did. Mick then went on to create Spike, an online magazine, and has emerged in recent years prior to Leveson, but certainly during and since the Leveson inquiry, as a fearsome proponent of the point of view that free speech cannot stand very much Leveson. The Leveson inquiry itself is undoubtedly, from the point of view of anybody who's worked in the news media in recent decades, the set-piece event of our lifetimes, although there is that. It has framed a proposition for reform, a proposition for reform in general, which opinion polls on the whole appear to suggest has the support of most members of the public. But given the complexity of the various reform proposals that have been put on the table, including the extremely voluminous Leveson inquiry report itself, there is also, I think, no doubt that this remains a moving story, even though we had I think in my lifetime, Trevor, you would know, unprecedented political circumstance of the overnight horse trade that Brian was involved in the other day with the, well, it would have to be unprecedented given that there was a coalition involved, but
I think it's what's called an ambush.
an ambush. Well, I think that may be one way of looking at it. But let's start there. I've asked our speakers to speak for 10 minutes, and I've asked them to focus on what they think is happening now and going to happen, and what they would like to happen next. How would they like this to turn out? But Brian, you were in the room keeping Oliver Letwin, the sole representative of the government.
No,
he wasn't.
Nick Clegg was there.
Yeah, well, sole representative of the Conservative part of the government. Yes, the senior party partner. But it all sounded very exciting. Although the critics of the process say that legislation created in those circumstances tends to produce a dangerous dogs act. Is that what we're going to get?
I don't think so, and I think you know, the circumstances were certainly odd. But if they were odd, it was because when Lord Justice Leveson reported in November, the Prime Minister chose not to follow the simple, straightforward, and open path that the judge had suggested. But instead chose to follow a path of secret conversations with newspaper owners and editors. It was the business of dragging that out into the open, into Parliament, that forced this somewhat dramatic climax. Although I have to say, we arrived in the room by 9, and it was clear that insofar as there was a deal, it had already been done. We were there to talk about how we felt about it, how we felt about, well, we had some input into discussions about how this would be delivered in terms of you know, the sort of balancing act of getting it in front of the public, which is something we have been banging on about for a long time. And then there was talk about the incentives that would be behind it, the court costs and exemplary damages clauses that in fact there was no agreement on the night and were deferred and are actually being dealt with in the Lords today. So it was certainly a long night, but it was a little less dramatic, I think, than it was made to appear. And I've said before, I never saw the pizzas. If there were pizzas, they never offered us any. We got Kit Kats. Let me just talk a little about the sort of package that comes out of it. The Charter is an odd way of packaging the Leveson proposals, but that's essentially what it does, with some variations, but not many. So let's look at what Leveson proposed, and start by looking at what he didn't propose. He didn't propose state regulation of the press. He didn't propose statutory regulation of the press, although we were warned. He didn't introduce a statutory right of reply that we were told this was a threat. He didn't indulge in any sweeping, he made some general criticisms of the press, but he did not go through the papers and point fingers of blame at individuals or editors or indeed titles in any particular way. He was, as I say, general in his conclusions. And he didn't impose compulsory regulation of the press. So there's a lot of the things, the bogies that existed before he published, never actually manifested themselves. What he recommended was an independent, effective, self-regulation scheme for the press. This is a scheme which would involve a complaint service that would be fair. It would be a complaint service that would not respond to public complaints in a way that Lord Justice Leveson found had been a pattern at the Press Complaints Commission, where the interests of the industry were often put first, and where there was a very regrettable lack of consistency in enforcing the code of practice. the discredited PCC had to be put in the past. He wanted a fair and effective system to deal with public complaints. The other thing he introduced, or proposed introducing, was an arbitration system. So this is where you have a cause in law against a newspaper, where it, for example, has might libel you or breach your rights in some other way. Instead of facing the challenge of having to go to court and having either to get yourself a no-win, no-fee agreement, which is, I can tell you, far more difficult than is suggested, or pay for it yourself, and we all know that the sums of money involved are simply not, they render the justice system unavailable to 95% of the country. Instead of that, he proposed an arbitration system which would be free or cheap to the public to use, where they could take their case. It would be dealt with briskly by a professional arbitrator. These things happen in all sorts of other industries. A professional arbitrator acting in a sort of inquisitorial fashion, dealing briskly with the issues, by consent of both parties, and producing an outcome in short order. So he offered a system where there was access to justice. And the benefits of that lie not just with the complainant, not just with the person with the plaintiff, but with the newspapers, who also would not face the huge costs of going to court over these matters. So that is what he suggested. Now, there are two other aspects to it which are worth dwelling on. One is that the whole system painstakingly avoids political interference. So there are two bodies involved. There is the new self-regulator which I've described, and it has to pass a sort of MOT test every 2 or 3 years to show that it isn't the PCC. That was axiomatic. He was not going to recommend a new regime which would slide back into the ownership, the captivity of the proprietors and editors, and no longer represent the interests of the public in its activities. So he proposed creating a recognition body, which is what the Charter sets up. This recognition body, once every 2 or 3 years, inspects the regulator and says whether it's meeting basic standards or not. Now, in all of this structure with these two bodies, the inspection body and the self-regulator, he is, as I say, painstaking in his efforts to prevent political influence. So no active politician can be on the board of the self-regulator. To point out that most of the chairs of the PCC have been serving members of the House of Lords, taking a party whip with the consent of the press itself. This was not deemed free from political interference, and that's what the Charter says. The regulator cannot have serving politicians on its board. It can't have them on its staff. The recognition body can't have serving politicians on its board. And it can't have serving politicians on the appointments panel that sets it up. There is a very laborious process on the funding side to ensure that the funding too is independent of political interference. So the arrangements there are as watertight as he could have suggested to ensure that this is a system that is not open to political meddling. One of the characteristics of the Charter, of any Charter, and it's not some a means of implementing this that hacked off would have chosen, but one of the aspects of the Charter is that all chartered bodies, historically, have been open to direct meddling by the Privy Council, which is the body that essentially issues the charters on behalf of the Queen. So there had to be measures, a special measure in this case, to protect this charter body from political interference. And that measure was a very bland clause in a bill in Parliament, which said that charters issued after the 1st of March 2013, which contained a clause saying that they could not be meddled with by the Privy Council, could not be meddled with by the Privy Council, and that gave it legal effect. So that bit of underpinning, you might call it, that bit of protection, was there to ensure there was no political meddling in this. Now, none of this is natural, none of this is what any journalist would think ideal. But it is necessary because of the background, because of the history, because although it's quite easy to forget after the passage of time, this arose because of a sequence of gross outrages committed by large national press organisations over several years, of which many ordinary members of the public were the victims. It was not, and I'm a journalist, I would wish it otherwise, but it was simply not possible to go on without change. You can say, that it would be ideal not to do it, certainly, but it's not possible to go on allowing newspaper organisations to infringe on the rights and the lives, the judge's phrase, wreaking havoc in the lives of ordinary people. It was not possible to go on without change. And I would hope, I've been asked to talk about the future, I would hope that after a period of calm reflection on what the Charter actually proposes and delivers, that the major news organisations will say, actually, I want to go into this. I want to show that my organisation has high standards. I am not afraid of being challenged about my standards. And journalists in these organisations would go into this and say, yes, this enables me to show that I have high standards and I'm part of a reputable organisation which does not, to use the phrase of a former news editor at the News of the World, go out and destroy people's lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. You hear there a concise account of, in some ways, a quite elaborate mechanic which is proposed by reformers, the justification of which Brian calls a sequence of gross outrages. Mick, I think you've, among the many things, or the few things that you have called the new arrangement, I think you called the Royal Charter-based approach a right royal disgrace to democracy. Tell us why.
Is it all right if I speak?
You can, it's all right.
I don't mind speaking. Being an old-fashioned propagandist,
Are you one of those speakers whose foot pumps, where the audience can't see it?
You can ring a bell if it does, I hope. Good afternoon, everybody. I think, to set this discussion in the context of your conference themes, if we want a snapshot of a political system in crisis or a political cycle that has come to a point of exhaustion, the shabby deal stitched up for press regulation in Miliband's office a few days ago would be a perfect snapshot of that process, of a political class entirely divorced from the public and from public debate, operating not in smoke-filled rooms with beer and sandwiches, but in smoke-free rooms with Kit Kats and Haribos in these more politically enlightened times, stitching up a deal which very casually puts at risk more than 300 years of an unlicensed press in this country. And I think, the fact that Brian and Hackdoff have had such an influence over this process, because as Brian's own modestly entitled book, Everybody's Hacked Off, plug for you there, Brian, makes clear, not only did they call for the inquiry, set the terms for the inquiry, set the tone of the inquiry, and write most of Leveson's proposals, but they were also in at the end of it. How could that be? And I think, given that, as Hacked Off themselves always say, they're a rather motley and small collection of academics and lawyers and actors and former comedians, and Steve Coogan, I refer to him as a former comedian now, become such a bore. How could they have exercised such influence over this discussion? And only because, how could it be the case that Hugh Grant could actually start acting as if he was the Prime Minister that he played in that dreadful film Love Actually, and phoning up the Shadow Cabinet demanding that they toe the line? How could this be the case in the 21st century? Only because we're dealing with such a supine political class that has abandoned any notion of defending press freedom, and therefore Hacked Off been pushing at a very open door. It's been a meeting of narrow minds between the Crusaders and our pathetic excuse for a political class. So I think it's a very good snapshot of a crisis of our political system. I want to go away from the kind of ins and outs of that shabby deal and re-establish some principles I think have been lost sight of in this discussion. It seems to me that the problem is that this great battle that's supposed to have been taking place over press freedom between the party leaders has been a completely phony war. Because all sides and all of the alternatives that have been on the table in those parliamentary discussions, and indeed outside it, all of them accept the central myth of the post-phone hacking Leveson discussion. And that myth is that the British press has in some way been too free to run wild and make trouble, and needs in some way to be reined in and tamed one way or another. That's been accepted on all sides, which is why in the end the Tories decided they had more in common with the Liberals and Labour than the opposed. They all accepted that fundamental point. And even many inside the press itself have accepted that fundamental point, accepted the Leveson point about the fact that the press needs to be tamed. See, Alan Rusbridge, editor of The Guardian, is written today, quibbling about the arrangements coming out of the Royal Charter deal. That's Alan Rusbridge who went to the Leveson inquiry and said the British press has been under-regulated. The editor of The Guardian. He's complaining about the fact, quite rightly, that the punitive exemplary damages threatened for those who refuse to sign up to the new regulator are a form of financial punishment. Quite rightly making that point. That's the same Alan Rusbridge who was credited with coming up with the idea that newspapers which refused to sign up to the new regulator could be forced to pay VAT, and therefore not treated as newspapers anymore. The Tories congratulated him for coming up with that idea a year or more ago, and now their quibbling is too little and much too late. My argument is, the argument of my book, there is no such thing as a free press available at the bookstore, and on at least 2 good websites. My argument is that the British press is neither free nor open enough already, even before a new regulator of one sort or another is appointed to wash its mouth out with soap. British press is already neither free nor open enough. It's already constrained by scores of laws, ranging from our execrable libel laws, which I have personal experience of, on one hand, and to the other side of the 2010 Bribery Act, which, as one investigations editor pointed out to me recently, has already created an ice age for investigative journalism, because you can't pay whistleblowers for information anymore, and you can't really publish anything that might be in the slightest way considered dubious. There are plenty of things wrong with the British press, plenty of things wrong. None of them will be solved by making it less free and more regulated. The phone hacking scandal was, of course, indefensible, and I don't think anybody's going to try to defend it. That is the phone hacking of these cases of Millie Dowler and so on, which caused such tremendous public outcry. I don't think that phone hacking in general is necessarily indefensible. Even The Guardian defended their own phone hacking to the Leveson inquiry on one occasion. Investigative journalism is a dirty business that requires all kinds of underhand methods. But certainly the cases at the heart of the phone hacking scandal are indefensible. The point is that that scandal has become the pretext for the pursuit of a wider agenda. It's become the pretext for an attempt to purge the press of what is not to the taste of certain people, particularly of what is not to the taste of those who believe that popular is a dirty word. Popular press is always used as a pejorative in these discussions. And these high-profile victims, who attract tremendous public sympathy, have basically been exploited as kind of human shields, behind which has been pushed a crusade of what I call in my book ethical cleansing. It's basically saying this is acceptable, that's not acceptable, we're drawing a line. Which is why the Leveson inquiry wasn't about phone hacking at all. The specifics of the phone hacking inquiry became completely buried in an inquiry into the entire culture and ethics of the British press. It became a pretext for purging the entire culture and ethics of the British press. Those were the terms of the inquiry, as requested by Hackdoff and agreed to by the government. Any form of regulation that's been suggested, whether it's statutory underpinning, statutory backing, whatever form of weasel word you want to use, or a royal charter, any of them amount to more state intervention in the affairs of a supposedly free press by any other name. And that is something which people have been struggling against for more than 500 years, since the first printing press was introduced into British society. What annoys me most is that it's the left, which I'm an old Marxist myself, the left and the forces of want to change society and think themselves as progressive have always been those who fought for press freedom, are now those calling for more regulation and control of the press. And we can already see the consequence of this. You know, I'm not scaremongering about Britain becoming Zimbabwe on sea and there being state censorship and politicians writing newspapers. There's no need to scaremonger about that. I'm not talking about that. Obviously, that was never on the table. We are talking about a much more heavy-handed atmosphere of conformism settling over the press, of dealing with a more sanitised, safer, tamer press. And we can already see that happening, and we've already seen the consequences, as the opponents, the enemies of press freedom kind of get the smell of blood. You already see a government minister calling for a newspaper editor to be sacked because he published a column that she objected to. We see huge protests now demanding that the Daily Mail sack Richard Littlejohn for publishing one of his typically offensive columns, which you don't have to agree with to see the dangers in something like that. And we see Labour MP Jim Sheridan suggesting that parliamentary sketch writers who write abusive descriptions of MPs should be banned from the parliamentary lobby. Now, because he probably doesn't know very much about history, and many of the parliamentarians don't these days, he may not realise, Jim Sheridan, that's an almost exact echo of a famous 18th century moment which kicked off the great struggle by John Wilkes and his allies to win the right to report Parliament in the press. When somebody called George Onslow demanded that the law banning press reports of Parliament should be enforced, and that statement by him was itself reported in two papers who described him as little cocking George Onslow. I always almost say little cocking George Osborne when I start, I remember this time. Little cocking George Onslow. And that got the printers jailed, the Lord Mayor of London sent to the Tower, 50,000 Londoners rioting outside Parliament in defence of freedom of the press and John Wilkes, shouting Wilkes and liberty, and almost lynching Lord North, the Prime Minister, as part of that protest. And now we have a Labour MP who feels quite able, little cocking Jim Sheridan, feels quite able to say that abusive journalists should be barred from the Commons without any danger of there being any riots outside of the protest. What I want to defend is the right of the press to be an unruly, troublemaking mess. That is when it's always been at its best in contributing to our as much as we have a political democracy. In order to defend that, I don't want to endorse everything or indeed anything that the press has done. You don't have to defend anything endorse anything they've done in order to defend that principle. All media outlets can get carried away. The News of the World got carried away, BBC, Newsnight got carried away. All media outlets can get carried away. The important thing to remember is the fact that some might abuse the freedom of the press cannot be turned into an excuse to allow others, and particularly those in authority, to encroach upon it for everybody. Everybody says they support freedom of expression and a free press, in principle. But I believe in a free press, but that's the slogan of our age. In practice, they don't. What I want to say is, my but is here, but here is the hard truth about the free press. It's free. The clue is in the question. And being a free press means it doesn't have to comply with what I would like it to be like, or what you would like it to be like, or what Lord Justice Leveson would like it to be like. That's what freedom of expression means. You might have to obey the law, but even that in certain circumstances is negotiable. But it certainly doesn't have to comply with the tastes or ethics of anybody else. Nobody has to be as pious as Lord Justice Leveson or Hugh Grant in order to qualify for freedom of expression. You don't have to pass somebody else's ethical test. Okay, free speech is not a gift to be handed down like charity only to the deserving. There's a debate in the Lords today, there's some amendments being put, and there's a movement to try and make sure that small community-based not-for-profit websites are removed from the new regulations and are left free. You might think, well, that's a good thing. And maybe it is, but even implicit in that, apparently liberal reform, is the idea that these people are deserving and decent and worthy, and therefore they can be given freedom of expression, but others must be brought under the policing powers of the new regulator. I will. Freedom of the press is the practical expression of freedom of expression, and we defend it for all or for none at all, in all of its forms, whether that's print, web, Twitter, whatever. I want to leave you one question that's never asked in this country in this discussion, which is, why do we need special regulation of the press at all? You're not supposed to ask that question. When I posed at a recent debate, a professor of journalism told me that was an other-planetary idea, that you could not have a regulated press. Which I asked him, did he mean that other planet, the USA? Where they have a First Amendment of the Constitution which makes it illegal to pass any law infringing on freedom of speech or freedom of the press, in which Lord Justice Leveson and his supporters would be laughed out of court if they attended anything like the inquiry, inquisition that we've had here. There are 45 words in the First Amendment of the American Constitution. I think it says a lot more